Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Ann McGovern from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. We are so glad you were able to join us today for this presentation on home composting. We are recording this webinar, so we are muting your microphones and turning off your cameras. And we are going to ask that if you have questions, you type them into the chat box. And if they're complicated and too long, you can type into the chat box the request to be unmuted to ask your question, and we'll unmute you. And you can ask your question that way. Just do be aware that we are recording this webinar. And when people join this webinar, it appears on my screen across the top, and I have to exit out. So if you see these black boxes come up, that's what that is from, and there's really nothing I can do about it. So,
and as soon as I admit them, it'll go away. So I'm admitting them as quickly as possible, so you don't have to X them out.
Okay, great. I will watch and see when you admit them. Oh, okay, so let's get on with it. Before we start the actual presentation, I was wondering who composts already, and if you compost, what do you compost? Your yard waste or your food scraps or compostable paper like paper towels? So we just put up a poll and ask that you would please let us know what you compost, or if you don't compost, or if you have your food waste collected for someone else to compost. And that will give us a better idea of who is here with us on this presentation and what your interest may be. And once we get a sense of that, I have another poll to ask more about what your interests are in this session, so I can make sure I cover what you are most interested in learning about today. And I can see on this, I can see the results of this poll so far, and it's where people are still joining the webinar. So we're going to leave this. Oh, okay. I think, are those the results? Okay. We have everybody in. It looks like that's great. It looks like about a little more than half of you or more are already composting. And for those of you who haven't tried composting yet, it's really easy. And I'm so glad you're with us. And for those of you who already do compost, maybe if we have time at the end, you can share some of your tips, because you can learn a lot from, we can all learn a lot from each other in this process. And now if we could get—
Do you want me to do the second poll now, Anne? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
Please. I drew on my slide and I don't know how to do it, how I did it or how to get it off. So anyhow, I hope you can't see it, but you probably can. So we were wondering what you're most interested in, and you can check everything. If you're interested in all of it, that's great. And just make sure that I do manage to cover as much as I can that you wanted to hear about today. This is great. This is great. I can see that there's a wide variety of what people are interested in. And so far, I can address all of these topics. Once we're close to 100%, Janice, you can close the poll. And I would also just like to thank my colleagues, Janice and Kathy, who are here with us helping run this show. So thank them. Thanks to them. All right, so I see we have a lot of interest in composting kitchen scraps, also yard waste and compostable paper waste, using an indoor worm bin, and how to use compost. And some are interested in learning about food waste collection. So we'll try to touch on all of those to the best we can. And with that, I'm going to get started. Why, can you see an orange thing on my screen? A line right here?
Yes.
Yes.
Pointer options. I'm going to try to get rid of it, but oops. Oh no. Okay, somehow I turned on my pointer. Erase all ink on slide. I'm sorry, folks. Just bear with me while I try to get rid of these lines. This is really frustrating. It's not going away. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start over. I mean, I'll open another version of this. Let's try this.
Looks good to me.
It's
Great.
gone now, Anne.
Okay. Great. So there's a lot of reasons why composting is a wonderful thing we can do. It can reduce the waste that requires disposal, either in landfills or waste to energy facilities. It can reduce greenhouse gas emissions that come out of landfills, and it can even help store carbon in the soil. And it recycles nutrients and organic matter for plants. It saves us money and avoided disposal costs and bags. If you have less trash to throw away, you don't have to have as many bags. And if you use your compost, you don't have to buy additional compost from somewhere else. And it's a great thing we can do. It's empowering to compost, and it's actually fascinating and fun. Here's a new infographic we made that kind of sums up all the benefits of composting. As you can see, food scraps make up almost 22% of the waste stream in Massachusetts. So by composting, you can turn those food scraps into black gold, which is using nature's recycling system. And then you can use that black gold in your garden for your vegetables or your perennials or whatever plants you have, even your house plants. And composting is beneficial to your plants because it adds nutrients, it holds moisture in the soil, and it stores carbon in the soil. So these all help the plants grow more strongly, and it's fun and easy to do. So what's composting all about? It's all about turning your scraps, your kitchen scraps and yard waste, into this material that looks like dirt, but it's really not dirt. If we were in person, I'd be passing around a sample of this. This is actually finished compost for you to see and smell and touch. And you'd notice that it smells kind of like sweet soil. And so the whole process of composting is making this happen. And to help describe and illustrate this process, I am going to show you.
We're seeing the green box again, Anne.
Okay, sorry. Now do you see my samples?
Yep.
Okay. There's an excellent video program made by the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Affairs. There's a link to it here. And when you go to this link, you'll see a page that looks like this. And if you click on the box, the image of the home composting image, it will take you to a screen that looks like this. And if you don't have Windows Media Player, you can download it. If you already do, then you go over here where this arrow is and click on this larger view using Windows Media Player, and that will open the program. And that is what I am hoping to do right now. I like to use this video when I give workshops because it illustrates the composting process, and it enables us to all get on the same page and get the same basic level of information. This is the 30th anniversary of this video presentation. And while it's a little bit dated, the principles of composting don't change. And I hope you'll learn something new. If you've already seen it, just gonna show a few minutes of it. So Then we'll come back to
Home composting
questions.
is our way of speeding up and enhancing Mother Nature's decomposition process.
Can everybody hear?
On the forest floor, it may take several years before leaves are transformed by naturally occurring organisms into rich organic soil. But by composting, you can create conditions under which these organisms will flourish, turning your yard and kitchen waste into a free, beneficial soil amendment for your garden, lawn, and potted plants in a matter of months. Home composting is less expensive and more efficient than transferring organic wastes to an incinerator, landfill, or even a centralized composting facility. It is environmentally sound, can be done almost anywhere, and enables householders to substantially reduce their trash. This program explains the basics of how to recycle your yard and kitchen waste through home composting, describes how to use your yard waste as mulch, and explains the importance of leaving grass clippings on the lawn. Home composting is not difficult or time-consuming. Most of the work is done by soil organisms, bacteria, mold, fungi, beetles, centipedes, insects, and earthworms are just some of the organisms which work together to decompose or recycle organic materials into humus. Like us, they need food, oxygen, and water for survival. Food for the microbes is your yard waste and kitchen scraps. These contain carbon for energy and nitrogen for growth and reproduction. Dry, woody things like dead autumn leaves, straw, paper, and sawdust are high in carbon. Fresh, moist materials like grass clippings, vegetable scraps, garden waste, coffee grounds, and manures are good sources of nitrogen. Composting a diverse mix of materials generally results in a good balance of carbon and nitrogen. Oxygen must be available for aerobic organisms to thrive. Oxygen can be supplied by periodically turning or mixing the pile with a pitchfork or by poking holes in it with a broom handle or special aeration tool. Aeration keeps the compost pile from developing unpleasant odors. Water is essential. With too little water, the organisms will slow down and can die. Too much water will eliminate oxygen and odors may result. The material in the pile should be kept as damp as a wrung-out sponge. Countless things can be composted at home. Citrus rinds, vegetable stalks and peelings, spoiled fruit and vegetables, coffee grounds, coffee filters and tea bags, eggshells, peanut shells, straw, weeds, garden waste, and paper towels, to name a few. But not everything belongs in the compost pile. Do not add meat or fish scraps, bones, fats, grease, oil, peanut butter, or dairy products such as milk, cheese, butter, mayonnaise, and yogurt. These foods can attract pests or cause odors. Do not add diseased plants, weeds that have gone to seed, or the roots of invasive plants such as quackgrass, wild morning glory, and bittersweet, which may survive the composting process and take root where the finished compost is used. Dog and cat waste can carry parasites transmittable to humans and should not be added to the pile. Using a compost bin to contain your organic materials may be preferable to an open compost pile because it discourages animals, makes the pile easier to manage, helps retain heat and moisture, and tends to look neater. There are many kinds of ready-made bins available through garden centers, department stores, and other retail outlets. Some are small and designed specifically for kitchen waste. These are referred to as digesters. Others are large enough to accommodate both yard and kitchen waste. With little expense and effort, you can build your own bin using scrap lumber, fencing, cinder blocks, pallets, or a combination of materials. A bin must be at least 3 feet wide, 3 feet long, and 3 feet high to provide enough mass to retain the heat generated by the microbes. It shouldn't be bigger than 5 feet in any dimension for ease of handling and to prevent compaction. The bin usually has an open base, which provides drainage and allows the composting materials to come in contact with natural soil organisms. A top is optional. Making sure that only the appropriate food scraps are added to the pile is the best method for keeping animals out of your compost. However, animal-proof bins can be purchased commercially or made by drilling quarter-inch holes in the sides, bottom, and top of a trash can with a tight locking lid. A wooden bin can be animal-proofed by lining it with half-inch metal mesh and securing a top. How fast composting takes place depends on the kinds of materials you add to the pile and the amount of time you're willing to dedicate to composting. The art of composting is simply balancing certain factors, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and moisture, to convert organic items into a rich humus within the time frame you have chosen. If you have little time to spend on composting and there's no hurry for a finished compost, you may want to try the passive method, using a holding bin. It is one of the easiest ways to compost, since no labor is required other than placing wastes in a bin and harvesting the compost from the bottom of the pile about 8 to 12 months later. If you have a large volume of organic wastes or want finished compost sooner, the active method may be more appropriate, using a turning unit. Turning units typically consist of a series of bins or a rotating barrel. This is an active method because the pile is periodically turned or moved into the next bin, which supplies oxygen to the organisms, allowing them to break down the wastes quickly. Weekly aeration can result in finished compost in less than 2 months. Whichever method you choose, passive or active, the recipe for creating a compost pile is the same. Start by placing your bin in a convenient location with good drainage. It can be in the sun or shade. Gather some materials to be composted, keeping in mind diversity, texture, carbon, and nitrogen. Chopping or shredding the material will help speed up the composting process. Put a layer of dry, woody, high-carbon materials, such as leaves, straw, or sawdust from untreated wood, in the bottom of the bin. Sprinkle with water to dampen the materials to the consistency of a wrung-out sponge. Then add a layer of moist, nitrogen-rich materials, such as grass clippings, garden spoils, and cow or horse manure. The thickness of the layers isn't critical, but no layer should be more than 6 inches deep. Mix the 2 layers together. A shovelful of soil or finished compost every so often will add even more organisms to the pile. Continue alternating, mixing, and watering the layers as materials become available, or until the bin is full. Don't be surprised if the compost pile is warm on the inside within a few days. Heat is a normal byproduct of composting and indicates that the microorganisms are working to break down the materials. Over time, the volume of material in the bin will shrink. Appropriate kitchen scraps can be added as they become available and should be buried in the center of the pile. Keep a container on the counter while preparing meals to easily collect the kitchen scraps. The container of scraps may be covered and stored in the refrigerator or under the counter until it is emptied into the compost bin. You can continue to put food scraps, coffee grounds, houseplant cuttings, and other organic items into the pile throughout the year. The composting process will slow down during the winter months, but will speed up again when spring arrives. Leaves alone will compost, but it will take a bit longer than if they are mixed with grass clippings, manure, or other nitrogen-rich materials. Although not essential, shredding leaves with a rotary lawnmower or home shredder will accelerate the composting process and quickly reduce their volume when space for composting is limited.
All right. So that was the basics of the Connecticut DEP video. It contains more information about chipping your brush and how to leave grass clippings on the lawn. So I do encourage you to watch the rest of it later on when you have a chance, or if you want to share it with your friends. It's an easy, quick way to learn the basics of composting. So composting is easy, and the reason for that is because most of the work is done by the soil organisms that live in the soil and live in your compost pile. And this is a little diagram that shows the types of organisms.
And you might want to go back one slide because the gray square was covering up the title. There you go.
Great. So composting is easy because most of the work is done by these by the soil organisms. And while I'm on this image, I just wanted to say that the main recipe we recommend is really simple. It's about 3 parts browns and 1 part greens. And the browns are the leaves and other types of material that are on this list here. These are all high in carbon. We call them browns. That's shorthand for high carbon material. And these are what the materials that will help your compost to not create odors. So that's why if you use more browns than greens, you shouldn't have any odors from your compost pile. The green material is typically high in nitrogen, and that can create odors. And so always bury the green material under the brown material and try to use more browns than greens. As it showed in the video, you can compost browns all by themselves because it won't result in too much nitrogen. But you don't want to compost all greens by themselves or you'll get some pretty odorous situations. So you can layer the materials or you can mix them as they become available. It really doesn't matter. And then after every 12 inches or so of fresh material, you want to add a few shovelfuls of rich soil or compost. And that's a free way to get the workforce of the compost pile into your bin, which is these creatures here. These creatures live in the soil and they live in decomposing organic material. So if you add some damp leaves to your compost pile, they're likely to have some worms on them. And the fungi and bacteria that do the work of decomposition will then go to work on the material in your compost bin. And then you want to keep it damp and aerated. And the reason for that is because these critters breathe oxygen, just like we do, and they need a moist environment. The bacteria need about 50% moisture in order to flourish, and the earthworms need moisture or they will die if they dry out. And then wait a few months and you'll get your black gold. Now by aerated, I kind of mentioned that these creatures need oxygen, but I didn't talk about how you can get the oxygen in. You saw from the video, you can turn your compost material from bin to bin. Alternatively, you can get a compost bin that aerates it from the bottom. We have one of those available on state contract, so it's not required for you to turn it to get air in. Or if you build your own bin, you can put coarse material at the bottom and that will create air passages in the bottom. And all of these are ways to make it easier for you so you don't have to be necessarily flipping your compost in order to get oxygen into it. If you build air passages in, that's the easiest way. And then depending on what you put in your bin and whether it was chopped up or not, you can wait either from 2 to 3 months to 6 months to a year before the material you added has turned to compost. And you'll know it's compost because it's going to look more like soil than the original ingredients. On the right side here are the list of things you don't want to compost in your compost bin or pile at home for the simple reason that these can create odors and attract animals or possibly carry diseases or pathogens such as dog and cat manure. Diseased plants could possibly survive, the disease could possibly survive the compost process and then reappear in your plants. So plants that have like diseases that can spread through fungal mechanisms, you probably better not to put them in your compost pile. Weeds that have gone to seed, if it's best to pull the weeds before they flower and before they set seed, so then you can just throw them in your bin. But if you have gone away for the summer and your weeds have all gone to seed, you might want to keep those seeds out of your compost pile so that they won't regrow when you use the compost. And weeds that spread by roots and runners can respread in the compost. So you can kill those first by letting them dry out on a hard surface, like a paved area. And when they're all dry and crispy, you can add them to your compost pile because they won't be able to re-sprout new plant parts at that point. And as I quickly pointed to them, you don't want to add meat and dairy products and peanut butter. These can all attract rodents and other animals. Dairy products can smell sour, and cooked foods with sauces might smell so good that they might attract animals. So those are the main reasons that we suggest keeping those items out of the compost. So I wanted to share with you some of these critters from the compost pile. When in an outdoor compost bin.
And
Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a couple people who are saying that the PowerPoint is fuzzy. So I don't know if you can make it bigger. It looks fine for me, very clear, but I don't know what's going on with other people. And then somebody else says, gray boxes, did you try turn off the optimize for showing video option?
Let me try that. I just
Okay, I
tried.
don't see any gray boxes now.
Awesome.
I don't know what the, okay, well, now I'm saying I can, yeah, okay, so it looks better now. Excellent. Sad that it took this long to figure that out, but okay.
Thank you, everybody, for your help. It may have been also the video that they were referring to, which is a little bit fuzzy. So let me know if you still see a problem with it. So these are the outdoor critters that you might see in a leaf pile or a yard waste pile or even a food scrap pile. There's actually a red worm right here. These are the little worms that help break down the food scraps, and a little snail and a little millipede. There's sow bugs and other creatures in here, and they all stay in the compost pile. So you don't have to worry about them like causing any destruction in your yard. They work on decomposing dead material for the most part, so they don't do any damage in your garden. And then if you don't have an outdoor bin and you have an indoor bin, you want to add red wigglers to it. These are the little red worms that love decaying material, and they'll speed up the composting process in an indoor bin. And if the compost works quickly enough, then you ought to be able to compost indoors without any odors or issues. So it's a great alternative if you don't have an outdoor space. So what can be composted? Well, in a nutshell, anything that was once alive will decompose. That includes all of our food waste, paper and paper products, because that came from trees, yard waste, as we already talked about, all kinds. Manure, we recommend herbivore manure like rabbits and chickens and goats and horses rather than dog and cat manure because it's just less pathogenic. Seaweed, and the list goes on. But what you put in your compost pile depends on the system you're using. For a home composting system, you want to limit what you put in. And I do want to, can you see the gray bar across the top here? Is it?
No.
Oh, okay, good. So this is a quick summary of how much compostable material is in the Massachusetts waste stream. It adds up to about 33%. And that consists of food waste, which is almost 22%, compostable paper waste, which is about 9%. And that consists of paper towels and tissues and napkins and all the kinds of paper that you can't necessarily put in your recycling bin. Waxed paper and waxed cardboard are all in that category. Yard waste is only about 2.5% because so many of us already compost or our town composts, and we send our yard waste to the town compost site. So altogether, that's about 33% of our waste stream that can be diverted by composting. So how many ways are there to compost? As I was saying, you can do it outdoors, you can do it indoors, you can do it on a farm, or a city or town can compost in windrows, which are long piles, or commercial systems might use an enclosed system so odors can't escape. In general, the larger the pile, the more likely the likelihood is increased for odor generation. And that's why home composting is a great alternative, because it's usually a pretty small pile and you usually get very few, if any, odors. The bigger the pile, you might get, it's harder to manage the odors. So some of these commercial facilities use an enclosed system, so the air is all contained. There's aerobic systems, which use oxygen, and they produce carbon dioxide and humus, which is another word for compost. And then there's also anaerobic digestion, which means it occurs without oxygen. And the end product of that is methane, or often referred to as natural gas. And that can be used to generate electricity. And that can be a benefit as well. We mostly don't know it, but we are all anaerobically digesting all the time in our stomachs. So we're intimately familiar with this system, even though we may not know it. So this presentation is talking about on-site composting. A lot of times people will say composting, I compost, but there a little distinctions need to be made, because composting basically refers to the decomposition process, but it can be done on-site or off-site. On-site composting we define as we're managing the decomposition process ourselves to convert organic waste into this soil-like product called humus. Off-site composting involves sorting, collecting, and sending our organic waste away to be composted elsewhere, like at a farm or a commercial compost facility. So the difference between on-site and off-site compost is who is managing the composting process. And the great thing about composting is it's nature's recycling system, and we can put that to work in our own households. Anybody can do it, and you can compost at home or at school, even at work. We have worm bins in the basement of the Department of Environmental Protection, and I know some other agencies have on-site composting systems as well. On the farm, in the basement, on the porch, if you prefer. You can compost in the woods or right in your garden. So there's countless different ways of composting. So I said all the different materials that could be composting, the giant universe of things, but what can be composted like safely at home includes mainly your vegetative food scraps, eggshells, coffee grounds, tea bags, and tea, and yard waste, leaves, grass clippings, prunings, weeds, garden debris, brush, pine needles, compostable paper, including waxed paper, paper towels, paper plates. As long as they're not coated with plastic, they will decompose. Corrugated cardboard, including waxed cardboard, and animal manure and bedding from herbivores like cows and chickens and horses. So really the majority of our organic waste can be composted at home. And just to quickly, I won't spend too much time on this because it's a very wordy slide, but I did an assessment of about how much compostable material we generate at home. And it works out to about 365 pounds a year of food waste, 50 to 100 pounds a year of compostable paper. Yard waste can vary anywhere from 15 to more than 100 pounds. So when you add this all together, it could be about 500 or more pounds per household per year. Now, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection has a state contract for compost bins, and any city or town can purchase bins at a low cost off that contract and then offer them to you. So, and the great thing about that is it's an easy way to get a containerized system at a low cost. And these compost bins, there are two types. One is the Earth Machine. That one can compost about 500 pounds of material per year. And then the New Age composter can compost about 1,000 pounds of material per year. So either bin will compost most of our material that we generate. So it makes a great fit. And if you want to calculate diversion, you can multiply the number of bins your city or town has distributed by about an average of 750 pounds per year. And the bins are warranted for 10 years. So when you add that all up, it adds up to about almost 3.5 tons for every bin that a town distributes is being composted over the lifetime of that bin. So a lot of times people think, what difference can I make? You know, I put my food waste in a compost pile, but it doesn't really add up, but it really does add up. So, so you really can make a difference just by composting at home. I mentioned briefly the compost bins on state contract. Your city and town can take advantage of these and then sell them to you We have a link on our website that shows which cities, lists the cities and towns that distribute these compost bins. Some of them offer them at a subsidized rate, so you can get them for as low as $25. Some of them do not. The actual cost of these bins ranges from $53 to $66, depending on which size they sell. The bin 24 is 24 cubic foot capacity bin, which is almost a cubic yard, which is almost the optimum size for composting. You can fit a lot of material in there and it will compost very quickly. This is a cutaway view, and the bin has a floor that sticks up in the bottom with holes in it. So that's how air can get in. And if you want to prop that up, you can put detergent bottles with the caps on tightly underneath, and that'll help hold that cone up so air can keep getting to the bottom of your pile. And then it has a cover. This is all intact, and it has holes in it so the rain can get in. So this is the New Age composter. It's made in New Bedford out of recycled plastic. So it's a wonderful Massachusetts product. We've had a lot of good reports from people who've used these compost bins, and it was invented in Massachusetts as well. So you're lucky to live here. We also have a bin called the Earth Machine on state contract. This bin is also made of recycled plastic, and they range in price for about $50. And as I said, some of the towns sell them for $25. So it's a great opportunity. Both of these bins would retail for about twice as much as the state contract price. So they would be at least $100, if not more. So even if your town sells them at cost or full price of $50 or $60, it's still a great value. And these bins have 10 cubic foot capacity. So they're about a third the size of the New Age. And they have a little door at the bottom that you can slide up to get the compost out from the bottom. And so these are good, especially if you don't have a large yard. If you don't have a lot of yard waste, then this bin should give you plenty of capacity for your food scraps and paper scraps. There's also a tumbler on state contract, and this is also available, but it's a bit pricier, so it may or may not be easily obtainable depending on the situation. But there's also a lot of compost bins available online that you can get. And you can also build your own, as we saw in the video, many different ways to build a bin. Before I go farther, I'd like to know if we have any questions. Any questions yet?
And yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So if you're ready, we can get started.
All right.
So first, how about seafood shells, like lobster or shrimp shells in my composting?
Those are fine. Just bury them under the leaves so you don't get that fishy smell, but they will decompose. Clam shells and oyster shells won't really decompose because they're very made of mineral, but you can put them straight in your garden and they'll add calcium to the soil. But lobster shells and shrimp shells are a softer material that will decompose. So, yeah.
Next, I've heard that adding onions or orange peels slow down the composting process. Is this true?
I've noticed that onions and oranges can create odors that smell like rotten fruit and stinky onions, and that might be where that information came from. As far as their decomposability, they will both decompose. Onion skins are pretty tough, so they might take a while, maybe a month or two. Most food scraps will decompose in as little as a month to 2 months. Orange peels, if they dry out, will become as tough as leather, and they will be very resistant to decay. So they can be tough because those peels are protecting the fruit inside. So they're designed to be protective. So if you cut them in half or in quarters and bury them into the damp material in the bin, make sure they stay damp, they will decompose in about 2 to 3 months. Anything else?
Yes. What about shredded paper?
Shredded paper, if it's office paper and it has toner ink on it, you might want to hesitate about putting it in the compost because we don't know exactly what's in toner ink or other inks. Newspaper ink is generally thought to be not a problem for composting. It's generally a carbon-based ink, but some of the printer ink, it has a plastic, a polymer, and it just may be, it just may end up giving you things in your compost that you might not want. The bleached paper, like office paper, I've noticed it takes a longer time to decompose, and it might be because it was bleached. There might be some chlorine still on it or some remnants of that, of the bleach. But what you compost in this regard is on a spectrum depending on your own choice. And if you want to put shredded paper in your compost, I have not read any reports that say that it has caused toxic conditions in compost. So while I say you might hesitate, that's to be on the conservative side. For instance, if you just grow everything organically, you want to make sure that your soil is completely organic and there's no synthetic chemicals in it, then you'd want to be more cautious. So the answer is yes, you may, and you may not wish to.
All right, great. We have a lot of questions, so I don't know how much longer you want to pause for, if you want to wait to the end to really get into them.
More questions, more questions.
Okay. In one of the tumbler style compost bins, what's the best way to introduce microorganisms into the pile if you don't already have existing compost?
Dirt. Hopefully you have some soil. If you don't have like any soil at all, just garden soil, we'll add those microbes fine to a few shovelfuls of dirt. I call it dirt because you don't want to use purchased potting soil because that's going to be quite sterile. So you want to use some outdoor soil, and a few shovelfuls into your tumbler should help the process start. And then once it gets going, it'll start to multiply within that material.
Okay. Next is, I tend not to compost the seeds from fruits and veggies, so I don't have things growing unexpectedly when I use my compost. Is that necessary to do, or should I just throw in all the seeds in with the scraps?
Well, that's also up to you. I put the seeds in because I enjoy seeing what grows out of the compost pile. And sometimes I get some free tomato plants that I didn't plant. But if you have a very tidy flower garden and you don't want vegetables in it, then you might want to keep the seeds out. Many of the seeds will not actually sprout. So another thing is, if you use your compost, sometimes I use most of my compost when I'm planting a plant, and I bury the compost. I dig the hole, I put some compost in the bottom of the hole, I put the plant in and water it and put the soil back. So if you're using compost deep under the ground, then you don't have to worry about seeds, volunteer seeds, or even weed seeds. But if you're going to spread it all over your lawn and you don't want squashes growing, then consider keeping the seeds out.
Okay, so this one's about waxed paper. I was under the impression that waxed paper should not be composted as it's often bleached or the wax used is inorganic.
Well, it really, there's not a lot of wax paper out there. Most of what we think of as wax paper turns out to be plastic coated. So if it's wax paper that you buy in a roll, that's fine. The wax will decompose. If it's a milk carton, that's not wax. So one way to check is to scrape it with your fingernail, and if you can get it to scrape off, then it is waxed. But if you're concerned about bleaching or other chemicals that might be in it, then it's safest to leave it out. So that again is another thing that's optional depending on your own intentions. Sorry to be, I hope I'm not being wishy-washy in my answer, but it could, it's typically going to be fine to compost, but there are cases where I used to compost all the pizza, like the liners from pizza boxes. And then I learned that there's a chemical that may be coating those liners that don't decompose. So now I keep them out. So if that's your concern, then you might want to keep those materials out.
Okay. What about paper plates that have some cooked food residue on them?
They'll compost faster if they have cooked food residue on them. And that's usually what I end up doing. I have a worm bin, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And I use paper plates. We don't like to use paper plates it's not ideally we would use completely durable ware. But if you can compost your paper plates, then at least you're turning them into compost. So, and it gives you a source of carbon. So don't worry about food being on there.
How important is the brown and green ratio? Is there a way I can do composting by only using my kitchen scraps?
Well, I would add paper. If you just add kitchen scraps, you will end up with a kind of a slimy material that will smell sour, kind of like garbage. So that's the problem. So yeah, it's pretty important. And you could, an easy way to get carbon into your compost is to collect your food scraps in a paper bag and then rip the paper bag up and add that. Or rip up, if you can find newspaper anymore, rip up a newspaper into strips and add that. But it is important that you don't compost food scraps just by themselves, or you could get odors.
Okay, so from that, what should you do if your compost gets too wet, smelly, and anaerobic?
Add some leaves to add some more carbon material. Leaves will also, or dried paper. If it's too wet, then add some dried material like dried leaves or dried paper products. I'm racking my brain now for other high carbon material that's not paper, because not everybody might not have paper available for composting. So, oh, I know what it is, a bale of straw. You might need to go, if you don't use paper plates or paper towels or napkins that aren't cloth, if you don't use any of those paper products, you can go to a local garden center and buy a bale of mulch hay or mulch straw, put that next to your compost bin, and cover your food scraps with that. And if your pile is wet and anaerobic and smelly, mix the straw or the leaves, other coarse material into that stinky wet material to get some air pockets in and get more carbon in. Then cover it on top with the carbon material, because that will act like a filter and it will filter out any odors. And then add some soil on top of that. And the soil will also filter down and help the material decompose, and it'll also filter out any odors.
Okay. Can you use pine needles?
Yes, you can use pine needles. We recommend that pine needles take a long time to decompose. And they might add to the acidity of the compost. So we recommend that the whole pile should not consist of more than 10% pine needles. But what you can do with your pine needles is use them as mulch directly around the plants that like acid soil, like pine trees. If sometimes you have a pine tree, it's in your lawn, so you need to get those pine needles up. But if your pine tree is on the edge of the lawn, then just rake the pine needles around the tree. And also plants like rhododendrons and blueberries and other acid-loving plants, azaleas, for instance, will all benefit from a pine needle mulch. And those pine needles take a long time to decompose, so they'll make a nice mulch, and it'll help prevent weeds from coming through. But yes, you can compost them as well. Just be prepared for it to take about a year or more.
Okay. What about parchment paper?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that. I think the answer is it's best not to compost it. I meant to look that up and I forgot. So sorry, but I think parchment paper might be treated with something that might either prevent it from decomposing or could be problematic. You could always Google, can I compost parchment paper? Nowadays, you can Google so much and it might give you a better answer than that, but I would err on the side of caution and not compost it.
Okay, and are corn cobs compostable?
Yes, and they take a very long time. They are very tough. They're very high in carbon and fiber. So if you can break them in half and then bury them into the compost pile so they stay damp, as long as they're kept damp, they will decompose within about a year.
Great. So it's kind of getting a little quiet in the chat. So last one, I think. Who do we contact to see if our town sells compost bins?
Yes, Kathy, could you put in, do you have the link to the compost bin distribution list? We will type that into the chat.
I just sent it.
Oh,
yeah.
Great, thank you. So, and if your town doesn't sell them, you can always call up the health department or the public works department or the recycling department and ask them to participate so that you and your neighbors can get these bins. All right, so let me move along here. So how to compost, you want food for the microbes and other critters, moisture, about 50% moisture, oxygen, and a temperature that's habitable. If it freezes solid in the wintertime, it will kind of come to a halt, but then you can keep adding material, and as the weather warms up, the material will continue to decompose. So you don't have to purchase commercial inoculants, but it is a good idea to sprinkle in some soil or finished compost or even partly composted material in between the fresh layers. Lime is an optional ingredient and you really don't need to add it. It might raise the pH too much, so it's probably better just to stay away from that. And by lime, I mean calcium carbonate, not the fruit. The fruit is fine to compost. So as I mentioned, you don't want, in a low-tech home compost bin type system, these are the materials you don't want to compost. They'll either cause odors or create or attract animals, or large branches will just get in your way later on. And you can put your branches in a branch pile or a brush pile, and later on that will decompose, or you can try chipping it up, or let it compost in place over time, and the birds will nest in there. It becomes a little wildlife habitat. You don't want to add toxic materials to your compost like pesticides, petroleum products, chlorine. Don't water your compost pile with your swimming pool water because it'll kill off the organisms. Treated wood, like pressure treated wood, you really don't want to put in your compost. You don't want to put trash, especially trash that can't decompose, like glass, metal, and plastic. And if you can exclude diseased plants and weed seeds and weeds that spread by roots and runners and invasive plants, then you'll get the best results. And so these are the materials. These are what I was trying to think of, the different materials that are high in carbon and the materials that are high in nitrogen. So if you don't have any leaves, get some straw. Or you might be able to get some sawdust or wood chips. So you ought to be able to find some carbon material, but you'll be glad that you did, because it will capture any odors and prevent the green materials from creating odors. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio, someone asked how important that was, and I did say it's responsible for odor generation. It also causes the compost to heat up and break down faster, and it's somewhat responsible for the nitrogen content of the end product. You might read that the carbon to nitrogen ratio should be 30:1, but yet I was saying you want 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So it's confusing. And the reason why it's confusing is because each material has its own unique carbon to nitrogen ratio. For instance, oak leaves are about 80:1 carbon to nitrogen. And this is by weight, by molecular weight. And green material like grass clippings might be 15:1. And basically anything that's considered above 30:1 is considered high in carbon. And anything below 30:1 is considered high in nitrogen. Everything alive has some carbon in it because that's a building block of life. But that ratio, that's the cutoff point for high carbon, high nitrogen. So that's why there's this whole range of oak leaves, maple leaves, pine needles. They all vary, and sawdust might be as high as 700:1. So that means it's going to take longer to decompose. The greens, which may be lower than 30:1, the excess nitrogen can go into the air as ammonia or hydrogen sulfide, smell like rotting eggs. So what you're doing to get a ratio of 30:1, you're mixing materials together and you're going to get an average. And so you want that average to be about 30:1. So if you were to weigh it out, you'd find that about equal parts by weight of browns and greens would usually give you a ratio of 30:1. But since most people don't weigh their material before they compost it, we converted it to volume. And since the brown ingredients are usually dry, they're usually lighter. So we converted that equal parts into a higher volume of browns to greens because the browns weigh less. So the simple rule of thumb to achieve that 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is to build your pile using a mix of 3 parts browns to 1 part greens. For example, fill your bin up with 3/4 of the way with leaves and then 25% with grass clippings or vegetative food scraps, and bury those under the leaf material, and you'll approximate that 30-to-1 nitrogen ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio, and your compost will happen very quickly. And as I said, you can interchange other ingredients from that browns and greens categories. So here's just some images that you can see, some high nitrogen material. This is actually from Marshfield Fair, but if you had a big cookout and you had a lot of watermelons served, then you could compost those. Just cover it with some cardboard and straw and finished compost or partly decomposed material, and water it to make sure the cardboard gets wet. Put in more cardboard because you need a lot of volume to exceed this amount of volume. And then top it off with hay, put the cover on, and a week or so later it had shrunken down by about half and we could add more material. So it's all a matter of putting the material in and watching it shrink down and then adding more. And if you find you need more capacity for your material, then you can just add on more compost bins. You might need 2. An easy way to get carbon into the bin is to collect your kitchen scraps in a paper bag, dump it out into the compost bin and rip the bag up, and then leave that on top, and there you've added some carbon each time. Likewise, you can line your container with a paper bag, and that makes it easier to clean the container, as well as adding the carbon when you dump that food scrap into the bin, rip up the paper bag and throw that in as well. Moisture, you want the leaves to be damp. They should be kind of damp to the touch. If they're rustling in your bin, then they're too dry and they're not going to break down as quickly as if they're nice and damp. So if you stir your compost and you hear the leaves rustling, then you know you need to add some more water. So I always recommend that you put your compost piles near where you can reach it with the hose. So if it dries out, you can add water. Wet material, food waste tends to be wet. So when you mix the wet material in with the dry leaves, that will help distribute the moisture more evenly. Someone asked if their pile is too wet, then what? Then mix in more dry leaves. If it's too dry, add in some damp food scrap material, and then water if you need it. So it's a little bit of a mix and match process, which is part of the fun. That's why I say composting is fun, because you have to think like, what can I do now? I need something dry and woody. Oh, I have some wood chips. Oh, good. Okay, put those in. So your compost system, if you're going to compost food scraps, we do recommend that it be enclosed. If you're just composting yard waste, you can have an open pile because the leaves and grass clippings are not typically going to attract animals. So the main reason for an enclosed system is to keep the animals away and to keep it contained. So if you want it to be rodent proof and the bin you have is plastic, you can surround it with 1/2-inch metal mesh. It's also sometimes called hardware cloth, and surround it on the sides, top and bottom with this 1/2-inch metal mesh, and that will rodent proof your bin. Likewise, if you have a garbage can, you can make a rodent proof bin out of a metal garbage can by drilling holes in it for air, and the metal will keep the animals out. You want it about 1 cubic yard if possible, which is 27 cubic feet or 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. That will allow you to have hot, efficient compost. But if you don't have that much material and your pile doesn't heat up, don't worry, it will still decompose perfectly well. It doesn't. You might read that your compost has to get hot in order to really work, but it doesn't. It's not a requirement. You can have a cool compost process and it will still give you fine compost at the end. The heat might kill off weed seeds. That's a benefit. So if you don't have hot compost, you might want to make sure you don't put weed seeds in there that you don't want to see back in your yard. You can build in aeration so you don't have to get out there and turn it. Or if you want aerobic exercise, you can get out there and turn it. It's up to you. And make it easy for whoever's using it to use it. So if it's for kids, it should be small enough that they can reach and get into it and and accessible for them. And if you don't have an outdoor area, try an enclosed system on the deck or a porch if you have that. And where should you put your compost bin? Well, depends how big a space you need, but you want it to be convenient and so that you can get to it easily, especially in the wintertime. And so you don't have to shovel a really long path. Sometimes people put their compost piles way out back so they don't have to see it, but then they can't get to it in the winter, or they can't reach it with the garden hose. You want to be able to reach it with your hose. I like to put it near where I'm going to use the compost. So near the garden and also near the hose. And I do like to put it out of sight as much as possible because it's not the most attractive looking thing. So you can put plants around your compost pile or put it in a corner where it's out of the way. It doesn't matter whether it's in the sun or the shade. It's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. In the sun, it might get a little more heat from the sun and compost faster, but it also will dry out sooner. So you'll have to add water. If it's in the shade, it won't get as damp. I mean, it won't get warm from the sun. So it might take a little longer, but it won't the moisture won't evaporate as quickly, so it'll stay damp longer. You won't have to add as much water. So, but either way, it will work. So put it in the most convenient spot for you. Don't put it in a wetland or on the edge of a wetland. Try to put it in such a way that it won't annoy your neighbors. If you put it out of sight, then that's the best way of avoiding any kinds of issues. This is a case where we put it behind the building. We have 3 bins here at the Marshfield Fairgrounds. This is the administration building, so we needed it to be close enough to get the tools and the hose to it, but also out of sight for the most part. It's tucked into a little corner here. And as long as we kept it odor-free, which we were able to do, no one knew it was there. So we compost about half a ton of food scraps, lemon peels and onion peels from the Marshfield Fair, and give away the compost the following year to the next round of fairgoers. So these are the tools you might want for your compost process: a hose, some gloves, a hoe, because you might want to stir your compost with a hoe. You could also use a pitchfork, a trowel, and this is a garden claw or cultivator, and a shovel. If you have a wheelbarrow, that can be handy. If you don't, you can gather your compost in a bucket or a pail, so you don't need to have that. And how do you get your compost out if your compost pile doesn't have a little door at the bottom? You can just dig down, push aside the material on top, and then dig down until you get to this brown stuff that looks like soil, and that's your compost. Put it into your pail or your bucket and take it out to your garden or wherever you're going to be using it. In a bin, to harvest as much of the compost as I could at a time, I pull aside the material from one side to the other with a hoe, the stuff on top, and expose the compost below, and then shovel that out into my wheelbarrow. And it takes me about 15 minutes to get one side emptied. Then I push aside the material from this side into this side and shovel out the other half. So it takes about a half an hour to empty the compost, and you only need to do it once a year. So it's really not a great amount of time that it takes. And then the longer your material sits in your compost bin, the more fine it becomes, and you don't need to sift it or screen it. So if you forget to harvest it, don't worry, it'll just get better with age. You can use your new compost for planting, and this compost helps hold water in the soil, so make sure you don't overwater it once you do that. I got my basil seeds to sprout in about 12 days. I used my compost full strength because I thought it would give the seeds a good start. But you might read that that's not recommended. It's better to mix it in with potting soil and sand so you have more aeration. So, but it's your own compost. You can try different things with it. It's fun to experiment. I use compost on the tops of my potted plants, especially if a plant is big and I don't have a bigger pot. I don't want to repot the whole thing, but in this case, the soil has shrunken down over the course of the year. So now I know it's time to add some compost. So I added compost, And this is a plant I've had in a pot. It's a rose bush. I bring it in every winter, and I get roses in the wintertime indoors in a sunny window. And feeding it with compost when necessary is all I do. So you can also mulch your garden or your woodland with leaves, and it will keep the weeds down, and the leaves will compost in place. And the plants, the woodland plants, will grow right up through the leaves. If you chip or shred your leaves first, they'll look more like mulch, but that's also optional. But just to give you some other ideas, that these organic materials are all beneficial to your trees and your shrubs. So you don't have to really rake up every single leaf off the soil. If you leave some of them down, it will actually help your plants. Helps hold moisture in the soil. So what if you don't have a yard or other outdoor space? You can make a worm bin, and you just get a container. This is really simple. You get a container of your choice. I use a plastic tote type container. Drill holes in the sides for air to get in. If I don't want people to know I have a worm bin in my kitchen, I don't put a sign on it. But if I do want people to know, I put a sign on it. So that also is optional. But if you compost with worms, and the process should be odor free and fly free. So no one should know you have worms in your kitchen if you choose to do that. So the holes you drill about 1/4 inch in diameter for the air to get in, and then use torn up waste paper as bedding. That's your browns ingredient. And the reason I recommend paper for an indoor worm bin is because if you use leaves, you might get that whole universe of sow bugs and millipedes and so forth that you might not actually want indoors. So using paper is a kind of a more sterile material. And then you just add a handful of soil to introduce the microbes that will break down the food scraps, and then the worms will aerate it and help break it down faster. You can either order worms online, or you can gather them from outdoors. They live in the layer where the leaves or other decomposing material meets the soil. And at this time of year, go out, you'll be able to find some red wigglers. This is a red wiggler here on this damp oak leaf. So you just dig down where the soil looks like humus or compost, and you're likely to find some red wigglers. You can tell they're compost worms because of where they're found. They're found in this decomposing material. And that's one of the reasons they work well in a worm bin, because they like that environment. And then also they're small. They're only about 1.5 inches long or smaller, and they're reddish in color. So those are the ones. Those are red wigglers. Put 2 of them in your container and add a little food scraps and just wait, and they will multiply if you don't want to purchase worms. But if you buy worms, you'll get about 1 pound usually, and that will be enough to start your worm bin going pretty quickly. If you start with less worms, then you want to add food slowly. A worm bin is basically a miniature compost bin, so it can only handle about 1 to 2 cups of food scraps per week. It's not a high volume composter, but you can add more worm bins. Down in the basement of DEP, we needed about, we composted about 3 cups a week. So we had 3 worm bins, and I would alternate which bin I put the material into. And after you bury your food scraps, you keep adding paper on the top, and that's what will keep the odors from escaping. And then cover the bin with a cover on it, and that'll keep the odors out too. If you get fruit flies, there's a couple of tricks. One is that 3 parts brown to 1 part green. You might need more paper or other high carbon material. Always bury the food scraps. That will make it harder for the fruit flies to know that there's food scraps in there. They won't smell it. Sometimes banana peels can carry larvae of fruit flies, and then they'll hatch in your worm bin. They also might hatch in your fruit bowl. And if that happens, you can make a fruit fly trap. Take a container and punch holes in the cover, about 1/4 inch in diameter, big enough for a fruit fly to enter. And then put some red wine vinegar or apple cider vinegar in the container and put it on the counter near the fruit bowl or near the worm bin. And over the course of 24 hours, many of the fruit flies will be attracted to that vinegar and go in your container, and they'll stay in there. They'll either drown, or you can take it outdoors and open it and let them go outside where they won't bother anybody. And that's an easy way to trap them. Another way to avoid fruit flies is to freeze your food scraps for a few days before you add them to your worm bin or even to your outdoor bin. So that just depends upon if you have room in your freezer for that and how much food scraps you generate. You might not have space for that, but that is an option if you have room. So it might take a week or two before, oh, and also with your worm bin, if you have a worm bin and you're trying to catch fruit flies, stop adding any more food scraps until the fruit flies have all been trapped. And then you can keep adding paper, but stop adding the fruit and vegetable scraps, because that will just make the fruit flies multiply more quickly. So I have a couple of videos that I wanted to show you. If I can bring these up, I will do so and show you. Let's see. Can you see that? Can you see a plate with worms on it?
We can't see the video. We can see your gallery.
Oh dear. Now can you see?
Yeah, we can see the video
Okay.
now.
All right. So this is a sample of worm material from my worm bin. These are the red wigglers, and that you can see they're only about 1 inch long, and this is what they look like. And they will multiply, and you can give them to friends. They will not overpopulate your bin, so you don't have to be concerned about that. And then let me see if I can. Here's a worm bin. This is underneath. The paper is on top. Can you see this?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So the worms are down in the damp material. They've turned that paper into this brown worm compost, and they do all the work down below. So if you don't want to see the worms, you don't have to worry about it, because you won't see them unless you dig down into it. And then to bury your food scraps, you dig a little hole, and you can wear gloves if you want to keep your hands clean, and bury the food scraps, dump the food scraps into the hole, and then cover that back up with paper. And a good suggestion is to bury your scraps in a different spot each time. So the first time you might bury your food scraps here, and then 3 or 4 days later, you might bury some more food scraps here. And then the next time, a few days later, or even daily, you can do it daily actually, bury them over here. And then the next time you add scraps, bury them here. And then the next time you add them, bury them here, and then here. And then by the time you get back to this first location, stuff you buried previously should have disappeared, and you can continue your going. If you find that there's still a lot of food scraps in there that haven't decomposed, then you need to stop adding food scraps until what you see starts to disappear, or you might get some odors. So it's a balancing act, and eventually you'll get a system that works out just right. And then I was wondering what was sprouting in my worm bin. So I dug down, I saw these sprouts in there, and I'm like, what are those things? And I dug down and I saw, I don't know if you can tell what this is, but you probably can. It's an avocado pit, and it sprouted because worm compost is one of the richest types of compost. So worms are really beneficial for your garden as well. So when you use your worm compost, if you get some worms in your garden, they will help. And again, if you don't want things sprouting, then just cut them up and throw them back in there, and they won't be able to live. But if you want some new house plants, there you go. Now you have some avocados. And this was just to illustrate putting some compost on top of my rose bush. This compost looks a little bit leafy, but it's a year old. So if compost is a year old or more, it's generally perfectly fine to use, even if you can still recognize the little bits of leaves. They won't cause any problems to your plants, and they'll just decompose the rest of the way in the plant itself. So let's see. I'm sorry. I am, can you see this? I'm scrolling through. I kind of lost my place in the, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. So yeah, that was basically the end of my presentation. We have resources on the DEP website. And also I had mentioned about the Connecticut video. This is the link to that. We'll make these, we'll make the slide deck available to you afterwards. So you'll get all these links. And there's these other resources on here. There's a place in Connecticut that sells red wigglers called Wiggle Room. There's other places as well, but that's a local place. And there's books about composting. The Rodale Guide to Composting is a good one. And Worms Eat My Garbage is a great resource for worm composting. Biocycle and Organic Gardening are great journals available online. And then this is when you go to our home composting page, home composting and green landscaping, you'll see there's links to backyard composting, indoor composting, and a bunch of materials you can use to help share composting with your friends and neighbors. So if anybody is interested in promoting composting in your neighborhood or your town, let us know. We'll be happy to share these materials with you.
And
Yeah.
a lot of people are signing off. So if you want to get to the Q&As, the last of the Q&As, we had a lot of questions about worm bins.
All right, let's have some more questions.
Okay, so let's get started with the worm bin questions. Just one sec. Okay, can you keep the worm bin in the garage?
Yes, you can keep the worm bin in the garage. If it goes below 30, worms like a temperature between 40 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. They will live below that, but if it gets down below 32, if it gets really freezing cold out in the garage, then you might want to bring them in and put them in the basement. So it kind of depends a little bit upon how cold the garage gets. But I think if the garage is connected to the house and you might put some blankets around it in the wintertime, it should be fine.
Okay, can you use earthworms?
Yes, you can use earthworms. They're very similar. They all eat organic material, and whatever worms you find outside, you can put in a container. The large night crawlers, which are the really long worms, those are not the greatest for indoor composting because they like to go real deep in the soil. The worms that are best for composting are the surface dwellers. So if you use worms that you find close to the surface, those are the ones that will be content in a container.
Okay, and how often should someone empty their worm bin, sort the worms out, and start over?
Oh, great question. About once a year. You don't really need to do it too often. It's similar to an outdoor compost pile. And what I do when the worm bin gets about half full of that brown material, the compost, or more, then it's time to empty it. But it does take at least 6 months before that time, before it really gets half full of compost. And what you can do at that point is start burying the food scraps just on one side and leave the other side alone. And in about a month, the worms will have mostly crawled over to where the fresh food scraps are, and they will have left the other side relatively free of worms. Then you put gloves on, you get a container that you want to put your worm compost into, and you put gloves on, like nitrile or latex gloves, and you dig up you grab a little handful of that compost from the bin. And if you see worms in there, you throw them to the side that has the worms. You're going to do just one half of your worm bin at a time. And so one side will have the fresher food scraps and the worms, and you push everything over to that side. And then when you get down to the compost, you pull that out a handful at a time. And also the worms don't like light. So you do this with a light overhead. And as you're scraping the top layer of compost off, the worms will be crawling down to get away from that source of light and making it easier they're basically separating themselves from the compost above. So you scrape a layer off the top, pull out any worms, put it in your bucket, and then scrape another layer, pull out any worms, throw them back in the other side, and put them in your bucket. And in about 10 or 15 minutes, you will have gone through one half of your bin. Then you can push everything over to the other side and start feeding that side. And a few weeks later, do the same thing.
All right. And what's the difference between a compost bin and a worm bin? Do they do the same job?
They do the same job. The main difference is the worm bin is smaller. I think of it as kind of a miniature compost bin, but they both use that food web of the compost organisms, decomposer organisms. They both have bacteria in them that helps break the food scraps down, but the worms speed up the process because they aerate it and they help to process it faster. So that's the reason that we add worms to an indoor worm bin, just so it will compost faster. And in an outdoor compost bin that's exposed to the ground, the chances are very likely that you will get red wigglers in your outdoor compost bin as well. And then that will help that material break down faster as well. So your outdoor bin might become a worm bin. So yeah, they're basically the same exact process. One difference is that an outdoor compost bin is fine if it heats up to over 100 degrees, but an indoor worm bin is a cooler process. But other than that, it's using the same method of decomposition.
Okay, so I think that was it for the worm bin questions, but we do have other questions. So what are the pros and cons of burying your scraps in a hole?
Burying your scraps in a hole. That is a type of composting. It's called in-ground composting, where you can even dig a trench. If you have it's not necessarily a bad way of decomposing your food scraps, but it's more ideal if you do it in a garden situation, because you will be enriching that soil when you bury your food scraps. The following season, you can use that area for planting a garden. If you don't, then you just want to relocate the pile to another, or your hole or your trench. It's also called trench composting. And that's one way to compost where animals really shouldn't be attracted to it, because you dig a hole about 8 inches deep and bury the food scraps and then cover them with soil. And that the soil will prevent odors from coming out, and animals, it's a fairly animal-proof method of composting. So that is another way to compost. And there's really nothing wrong with doing that.
Okay. Do coffee grinds add carbon? Can you use it as the brown ratio instead of paper?
Oh, coffee grinds, that's funny. They tend to be high in nitrogen, but they also do contain carbon, but they tend to be wet. So they wouldn't make a good replacement for the browns in terms of a high carbon material. Although I guess if you could let them dry out, but no, they're still, coffee grounds are tricky, or coffee grinds are a little confusing because they're brown in color, but they're really more of a high nitrogen ingredient. Sorry. But the filter, if you use a paper filter, will be high in carbon. So you could add that together and you get some more carbon in there. I noticed one time when I put a lot of coffee grounds in my worm bin, the worms disappeared. So it is possible that if you put too much of an acidic material, like coffee grounds can be a little bit acidic, or orange peels. I've also heard that if you put a lot of pineapple, or put pineapple in a worm bin, it can have a negative impact on the worms. So the solution for that is to just put a diverse mix of materials into your worm bin, and you won't have that problem.
Okay. And are oak leaves too acidic?
Nope, oak leaves are actually, they are acidic when they're fresh, but as they go through the decomposition process, they become neutralized, and the end product is around a neutral acidity, or a neutral pH. So oak leaves make a perfectly fine compost, and I don't let any of them leave my yard, because they really do. They get a bad rap because a lot of times people say they don't decompose, or they're too acidic. But the trick with oak leaves is to make sure they stay damp And if you can shred them first, either with a lawnmower or with a leaf shredder, they'll break down quite a bit faster and they'll also take up a lot less space. But if you don't have that or you don't want to be doing that, you can just make your leaf pile and wet them down and then cover it with a tarp or a sheet of plastic and sprinkle on some soil to get the decomposers into the fresh leaf material, and then cover it with a tarp so it holds the moisture in, and check on it every so often to make sure it's damp, and it'll decompose within 1 year and give you a good compost. So, and it's also very high in minerals. So it's perfectly good.
Okay, great. I have ash from my smoker, sawdust, paper, pine needles, pine is fuel. Can I add the cooled ash from the smoker to the compost bin? If so, what amount or ratio?
Wood ash is very potent in terms of raising the pH. It will most plants like a pH of about 7, and if you raise the pH above that, they will not be able to get the nutrients they need. And wood ash, or also lime, gardener's lime, are both things that will raise the pH of the soil. So you can't, wood ashes are high in minerals, so they are beneficial, but you just want to use them very sparingly. And so you can go to UMass Green Info, and they have a handout on exactly measuring the amount of wood ash. But generally, as a general rule of thumb, if you think of wood ash as like salt and pepper, kind of like condiments, and you sprinkle them on with everything else in your pile as a sprinkling rather than a big shovelful dumped on there, it should be okay. So I'm not giving you an exact answer, because the answer is it all depends on what else is in there and how much you have and so forth. But if you just think of it as a condiment that you're going to sprinkle on, like a little sprinkling after every 12 inches of fresh material, then it should be fine. If you see earthworms in there, then you know it's working fine. If things seem to have come to a halt, then it might have become too not acidic enough. And you might want to add some more leaves to dilute it.
Okay.
It sounds like you have a lot of acidic material. So you'll be doing well if you grow blueberries, because they like acid soil.
Next, if the top of the bin is open in the winter, do you need to cover it from the snow?
No, actually the snow is usually beneficial because it adds more moisture that you might otherwise not get in there. So, and it will also help insulate the compost. So that's fine.
Okay, and do you have to worry about the ratios in the winter?
What I recommend is that you start out with more browns than greens, because you're not going to have you're not going to be probably able, well, if you can keep a bag of leaves or a bale of hay next to your compost pile so that you can still cover your food scraps in the wintertime, things will be slower because they will freeze in between. But in general, you do want to still try to get some carbon material on top of your food scraps. So one suggestion is, if you have a big bin, fill it up about halfway with leaves in the fall, and then throughout, or even 3/4 of the way with leaves. And then throughout the winter, try to bury the food scraps into those leaves, so you don't have to worry about getting more leaves in there. They'll already be in there. But and then if it's a big enough pile, they shouldn't totally freeze solid. But if they freeze solid, just throw in the food scraps, throw in some leaves if you have them, or if not, just put the cover on the bin, and when the weather warms up, you'll be able to stir it back in. So it doesn't have to be perfect.
Okay. This person says, I have a rotating bin. Do I have to stop adding stuff for a few months before I use the compost?
It sounds like that rotating bin just has one drum to it. And so the answer would be yes. You'd want to fill it up and add your material to it for however long it takes to fill it up. But then, yes, you want to probably give it about a month of turning before you empty it, because otherwise when you add fresh material, it will get mixed in with your finished material. So it's nice. They have, some of the drums have 2 chambers, so you can go back and forth. So you might need to get another drum.
And do you have any input or comments about curbside composting pickup services?
Well, it's a great opportunity. If you don't have a yard and you can't compost indoors for whatever reason, then it's great that you can send your food scraps off to be composted on a farm or a compost site. So it's a great option. Yes.
And what is compost tea and how is it used?
Compost tea.
Yeah.
Okay, compost tea is when you add water to finished compost, and and the liquid that comes out is called compost tea. You don't drink it, although there are some scientists who have discovered that humic substances are good for our health. So you might actually find probiotics and other materials that are actually related to humus and humic substances that are beneficial. But compost tea is generally something you put on the garden or on the lawn, and it's a way of getting some of the benefits of compost onto an area where you might not be able to spread physical compost. For instance, on a lawn, you can spray the liquid compost tea on it, or some people use it as a preventive from trying to keep insects and fungi off their various types of fruit plants. So you can spray it on, and it's thought that it gives beneficial organisms coverage on the leaves, and then the pest organisms can't get a foothold in there. So it's considered to be beneficial to plants as a treatment that way. It should be kept. The trick with compost tea is it needs oxygen in it. If it gets anaerobic and starts to ferment, then it can become acidic and kill your plants. So you need to stir it every day and then use it quite quickly, because if it loses its oxygen, it can get acidic. So some people actually, you can look online on how to brew compost tea. You take compost and you put it in a mesh bag and you put it in a big bucket, and then you put an aerator in there that pumps air through it. So you can get quite technical about it if you wish. But if you want to just do it low tech, you just add some water to some compost in a container and use that liquid on your garden or plants.
Okay, so it's pretty much all the questions. I really went through quite a bit. A lot of people are saying fabulous presentation. Thank you for the great information. They learned a lot. They're going to compost with confidence. So just thank you so much
Great.
for all your knowledge, Anne.
Oh, that's great. Well, Janice, if you're there, if you want to put on that last poll, we might get an idea. We did want to find out if this was helpful, and it's great to hear. Thank you for the kind comments. And if you can just answer this question, if you think you'll start composting now, or if you plan to start, that would be great. And we hope this was helpful. Great. Well, looks like most of you are going to be able to compost. For someone who can't compost, maybe you can figure out an alternative method or be in touch, and we'll see if we can help you out to figure a way that would work. And then I just wanted to give you all a surprise. Since I think composting is easy, I wrote a simple little song about it. So for those of you that are still here, you're going to get treated to a little song. It's not too long, and I hope you enjoy it. I can't make my piano work on Zoom because it just messes up. So I have to sing it with no accompaniment, but I'll just give myself a B flat here. Okay. There must be a million ways to do it. Compost happens. There's nothing to it. It's so easy. Everybody can do it. Compost for the earth. Well, you'll get the earth and the earth will be saved. A little bit more when you compost your waste. Banana peels, apple cores, stuff like that. Even paper towels. Wow, I didn't know that. Just like a miracle, the stuff will convert. Little bugs will eat it up and turn it to dirt. Put it in a garden or put it in a pot. All your plants will thank you 'cause it helps them a lot. be a million ways to do it. Compost happens. There's nothing to it. So easy, everybody can do it. Compost for the earth. You can do it in your own backyard, in the kitchen or the basement, even in the garage, in the bin or a pile in the house or the yard. Putting it together doesn't have to be hard. Figure out a system that works for you. Make it handy and convenient so it's easy to use. You want air and moisture to get into the bin. If you make it secure, critters can't get in. There must be a million ways to do it. Compost happens. There's nothing to it. It's so easy, you and I can do it. Compost for the earth. So first you want to fill your bin with dampened leaves, berry fruit and veggie scraps underneath. Sprinkle it with garden soil as you go. Soon there will be compost in the bottom, you know. When springtime comes and you're ready to plant, push aside the stuff on top with gloves on your hands. As you dig down the finished compost, you'll find when it looks and feels like soil, then you'll know that it's time to use it in the garden or in potted plants. It gives them what they need, and their growth will enhance. Compost holds moisture in the soil and gives it some food. It even hangs on to carbon, so the earth will thank you. There must be a million ways to do it. Compost happens. There's nothing to it. It's so easy, everybody can do it. Compost for the earth. Compost for the earth. Compost for the earth. Compost. Yeah.
And the crowd goes wild.
Well, thank you, everybody who stayed. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It was wonderful to share this presentation with you. I hope you learned what you wanted to know, and it was really a pleasure. And I hope to see you again.
Thanks, Anne. Anne, I'm going to turn off the recording and stop this meeting.